Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. And you probably are wondering why I'm saying good morning. I'm in live from California, U.S. We're going to be talking about the subject leadership perspectives, and we have a title: Your experience may be your greatest enemy. Um, I'm going to ask all of you a big favor as we go through this presentation. Um, I'll be honest with you, and that's one thing that I'll try to stick with throughout this presentation. This is my first webinar. I'm usually an in-person trainer, so I'm used to looking at faces. So it's a little bit difficult for me not seeing faces, but I'll do my best. What I like to do is to ask you to imagine this to be a story that connects you and me and our shared experiences. And it's sort of a journey of a learning process. And my hope, my wish is that through it all, it'll help us become sort of better learners, that it'll help you in your future journeys as you learn and develop yourself and as you help people around you develop. So that would be sort of the general background, if I may. And I like to proceed. The intro. Here, my name once again is Joseph Lee. Ali has introduced me, and these are all of the things that I've done. I'm basically a consultant by background. I was born in Hong Kong. I grew up in Japan, so I do speak Japanese. But I've lived all of my professional life pretty much in the United States. And when people ask me where you're from, are you Chinese? Are you American? Are you Japanese? I like to answer with them that I probably think like an American. So my brain is American. My blood is Chinese because I'm a big gambler. I'm not sure if I should say that here, but I'm a big gambler. So I'm a risk taker. So there's Chinese blood in me. But I like to say that my heart, I grew up in Japan, is very Japanese. So that's sort of the way I explain myself to people. And as you can see here, this is my granddaughter. So perhaps the most important title that I have right now is Grandpa. And I take that in perspective. And one of the words I like the most is that every day is a gift, and I accept that as a gift. So, hopefully I can share that with you. Just to tell you where I'm from, I'm in Bakersfield, California. Many people would think that California is a very progressive state, but here in Bakersfield, I'm just going to circle right around here. I'm in a place called Kern County, and perhaps just a little connection. Kern County happens to be the most productive oil-producing county in the United States, and over here we call it the Texas of California. So just as a backdrop, and the photo here actually is about 20 minutes from where I live. So you see all these oil fields. So California is the third largest oil producing state in the US, and Kern County is the #1 producing county. So that's where I'm originating from today. Let me share with you a little bit about what we do. I'm in a company called EAD. It's a partnership with another person that I do in Japan. And the primary goal is leadership development. And it's primarily about people. And I'll talk about it very, very briefly to give you a sense of the things that I do and why it's important and connect it to what we do. The way we look at it is that leadership is always going to be about people. Okay, I draw poorly. And it's not about leading a company. It's not about leading a town or a country. It's always about leading people. So how we interconnect with them is very important. We take a look at 3 sort of important tools that people would need to lead people. One is the whole idea of how do we impress upon them our message. And this is typically done in presentation trainings. How do we leave a lasting impression? The next thing that we do is how do we get the most out of people, extracting information, and we often call this facilitation training. The third thing that we do is that typically once we get people talking, they have differences. So how do we bridge the differences? And we use influencing techniques. And that's often in training called negotiation and conflict resolutions. And finally, what we like to do is how do we bridge all of that together? And we look at two things. One is the self, and then one is the worldview. And this we do in a class called Leadership Perspectives. It just so happens that coaching is one of my favorite topics these days, but coaching actually involves almost all of these tools. So this is the backdrop of what we do, and I just wanted to share that with you. Okay. Now, this is a list of some of the clients. Many of them may sound familiar. We work primarily with large clients, and I have the Japanese flag here. Almost all of my clients are in Japan. I live in LA, but I travel to Japan about a third of the time of the year and do a lot of executive training there. So this just gives you a backdrop of where I do the work. They have a very unique need in Japan right now. And then the big thing that they talk about is global leadership. And how do they make their people more global? This is a very, very big topic in Japan. And we start with how do we communicate? And it's very interesting because a country as successful as Japan, they are having a lot of difficulties, almost 20 to 30 years of no growth, and they're finding that they're being passed by China, they're being passed by South Korea, India, and so forth. So they're feeling a lot of pressure, and they're looking for ways, how do we change the way we think, and how do we get our people developed? So that's an area that's quite interesting. I think I've used this quote quite a bit. It's allegedly from Mark Twain. Let me read it to you. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Some of you may have seen the movie called The Big Short. This was used at the original part of it. Okay. This concept is very important because, even in developing people, I like to have people get a sense of what this concept is. We often go through training trying to become smarter and smarter. We acquire knowledge, we read books, and so forth. The problem is this: when we think we know the answer, we stop learning. We stop thinking. And so in spite of the fact that we are so smart, we make so many bad decisions. And that is something that has troubled behavioral scientists for a long time, is why are people smart and yet smart people make so many bad decisions? And this quote actually comes back a lot, that what gets us in trouble isn't that we don't know it. It's that we think we know it and we stop asking the questions. So stay with me in terms of this thought. Just in terms of sourcing, this is just some of the books that I've gone through in developing my training and so forth. Some concepts will be shared here. Please don't worry. I do have a sourcing and a bibliography at the end of the slide, so you can do your own research. One thing I ask my audience is please don't believe everything I say. You should double check everything I say. You should think about it. Because nobody's word is, magic. Nobody's word is the truth. So please do your own research and verify the things that trouble you, the things that confirm your beliefs, and so forth. So I urge you to do that. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the 60 minutes that we plan. We're doing a little intro right now. We'll talk a little bit about Drucker. After that, we'll talk about self-awareness and this whole idea of what our experience means. We'll talk about emotional intelligence. This is a topic that you can't avoid in modern day training. It's used a lot. in our world. It's used a lot actually in management philosophy these days. And then at midpoint, I'll talk about practical applications of what this means to specific situations. And I think of three. One involves people development and coaching. The other is around sales and negotiation. And finally, we'll talk about how we present and how we communicate our information, the practical application of some of the things we talk about. And then around the 35 to 40 minute mark, we'll open it up to Q&A, and hopefully you'll have questions. And then we'll try to wrap it up around the 50 to 55 minute mark, and we'll end this in an hour. So that would be the plan. So generally, some of the topics that we'll be covering, curiosity is going to be a pretty big deal. There's a lot of behavioral science around why we pay attention. There are many in our world who thinks that the most important thing that we have to manage is not time, it's not energy, but it's attention. Our entire lives basically is the summation of our attention. If we don't pay attention to something, it didn't happen. So instead of focusing on minute topics, the attention is the most important thing we can manage. And many people say that curiosity is at the center of attention. Unless you're curious, it's very hard to pay attention. The next thing we'll talk about is connecting some of the science to our daily lives. We have a lot of management philosophy, a lot of experience that tells us this has got to be truth because I experienced it. What we like to do is to go back into the science and see if we can connect that, to see if the experiences make sense or actually our experience may lie to us. I have the name Thaler here, but we'll talk about him toward the end of our discussion. And in the world of training, we focus on behavior change. And what I like to sort of focus on is that management and training has something in common. And that is, our goal is not to change how people think, but our goal is to change how they behave. And this is very important because it is very difficult to change how what someone believes and thinks, especially after they've lived 20, 30, 40 years. Their worldview is set. Research has indicated that after your college days, our ability to process new information goes down dramatically. In other words, once we have a worldview, we only accept certain kinds of information. The other reason we try to focus on behavior change rather than how people think is that how people think cannot be measured. But behavior can be measured. It's an activity. We can see it. Therefore, from a management perspective, we should always focus on what we can observe. The other thing about changing minds is that people don't always tell the truth. We ask them, do you understand? Are you with me? They have no choice but to say, oh yes, we see it, even though they don't believe that. So the important thing is, once again, behavioral change. How do we drive behavioral change? I don't want to say that we don't want to change how people think. What I'm saying is that the direction might be the opposite. By changing behavior, we may be able to change how they think, rather than the other way around. Let me start then with Peter Drucker. Drucker wrote a lot about management, but he often did not like the whole concept of leadership. Too many people thought leadership was about charisma. Too many people thought leadership was just about influencing. And so he used these words. Leadership, it's not about magnetic personality, because that could just be what he called glib tongue. Or it's not about making friends or influencing people, because that's flattery. Leadership is, and then he goes on to say, lifting a person's vision to higher heights. So he starts talking about vision. The raising of a person's performance to a higher standard. And then he uses the word performance. And finally, the building of a personality beyond its normal limitations. And then he talks about personality. So there are three things to leadership that he looks at: vision, performance, and personality. And then he lifts, he raises, and he builds. So instead of relying on something that is like a checklist for leadership, he says, whatever you have now, let's take it to a higher level. Okay, so this is the way that Drucker looked at leadership. It's raising something. And he loved to use the word contribution. By focusing on contribution, he said that it supplies the 4 basic requirements to effective human relations. Those 4 are communication, teamwork, self-development, and the development of others. And the way he looked at this is the reason you want to develop yourself is so that you can help the other people around you grow. In other words, a leader becomes successful not just by becoming better himself or herself, but helping the people around them become successful. Because if your focus is purely self-development, that is basically an ego trip. But when you focus on developing others, you actually raise yourself. So this is the way Peter Drucker looked at it. We're going to use the word self-awareness quite a bit. The dictionary definition is an awareness of one's own personality or character. Let me go to something that happened recently that sort of symbolizes what this is. There's a story of the first Chinese player to be inducted into the NBA, that's Basketball Hall of Fame. His name is Yao Ming. He was inducted about 6 months ago, September 9, 2016, and his Hall of Fame speech, he quoted an old Chinese proverb. There is an old saying in China that if the mirror is made of bronze, one can dress properly. If the mirror is history, one can predict ups and downs. If the mirror is people, one can reflect on one's own weaknesses and strengths. So Yao Ming, a basketball player, talks about reflection on one's own weakness and strength. And this is the concept of self-awareness. But this is not that easy. Self-awareness does not come naturally for a lot of people. So let's try to understand ourselves a little bit. Research has shown that we are bombarded by external factors, external information, and our brain actually processes about 11 million bits of information at any moment. Research tells us that of the 11 million bits of information, we consciously are aware of only 60. In other words, we go into the world practically blind. There has been a study, a fairly famous one called the Door study, which tests how good are we at paying attention. The Door study involves an experimenter who is standing here and a person who is an outside person. So he asks him for directions. How do I get to someplace? In the Door study, what happens is in the midst of asking a question, a moving company moves this door in between. The first person who is asking the question is replaced by a second person. And then the second person now is asking the same question. In this study, 50% of the people on this side did not notice. The change between this person and this person, even though they are clearly not the same. And what this shows is that we are not very good at paying attention to the stuff around us because we live in a world of what we assume rather than in a world of what is actually happening. And a world of what we assume is by definition our experience. Our experience actually can make us blind to what is happening there. Let's move on to the topic of emotional intelligence. This word will be at the foundation of most modern day training about how we behave. I don't want to get too detailed into the science, but I want to make it understandable for people who are not familiar with the concept. This is probably the easiest model that I like to use. So there's me, and there are other people. There's an awareness of emotions and working of emotions. So the awareness of emotions about myself is what we call self-awareness. The awareness of emotions of people around you, we call it social awareness. How we work with our emotions, we call this self-management, which is actually a pretty important topic for us today. And working with emotions with other people is called interpersonal skills. This is where we do a lot of the training. And as you can see, what puts everything together here is what we call empathy. And this is a word that is used quite frequently in the training world. So what is empathy? We often compare empathy with the word sympathy. Many people think they are the same, but put it simply, sympathy essentially drives away connections. Sympathy is where I'm living here and you are miserable because something bad happened to you and you are here. And what I'm trying to tell you is, you know what, get out of your miserable world and come over to my nice, happy world. This is the world of sympathy. It is the world of giving advice. It is the world of telling people, hey, let's go do shopping so that you feel better about yourself. It is the world where if a girlfriend goes with another guy, you tell them that, oh, she was not worth it. Empathy, on the other hand, I'll borrow the words of a nursing scholar called Teresa Wiseman. She said that there are 4 qualities of empathy, and it's all about driving connection with others. The first is perspective taking. Perspective taking means understanding that the other person's view of the world is their truth and being able to accept that. Staying out of judgment. When something happens to another person, we don't say whether it's good, it's bad, or you deserve it or you don't deserve it. We stay out of judgment. The third is recognizing emotion in other people. And finally, communicating that we recognize your emotion. These are the qualities of empathy. According to Brene Brown, and by the way, this comic actually is on YouTube. It is a very powerful tool that we use in training. Brene Brown mentioned that rarely does a response make something better. In other words, we tend to think that when we give somebody our word, it's supposed to make them feel better. But rarely does a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. So actually what is important is not the words themselves, but the fact that they know they have somebody to talk to. And this is the power of empathy. It is the ability to connect. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there and I'm going to move on. We'll come back to empathy again as we look at some of the practical examples. We talked a little bit about why experience might make us bad decision makers. So the question is, what can make us, make bad decisions? I go back to an article in the Washington Post about a year ago, and they talked about 2 effects. One is called the urgency effect, and the other is the permanence effect. The urgency effect means that, hey, we want an answer right away. It's called jumping to conclusions. I want to get an answer right away. And usually when you want to get to an answer right away, there's a tendency to make a mistake. The second is permanence effect. It's our inability to change our mind even though we see conflicting evidence. Okay, it's a stubborn tendency to stick with your beliefs and not change your mind even in the face of contradictory evidence. So both of these effects result from your brain trying to avoid feelings of uncertainty. So uncertainty is actually something that we hate. And what brings closure to uncertainty is what we call experience. The scary thing is that sometimes this is not true. I'm going to move on to something. Seth Godin is a rather famous writer and blogger. He talks about business a lot. About a year ago, he wrote a blog called Deconstructing Urgent versus Important. Let me read this to you. A 6-year-old who throws a tantrum and refuses to go to school is escalating into the urgent. But going to school every day is important. Getting your education is important. Mollifying an angry customer is urgent, but building systems and promises that keep customers from getting angry, that's important. Okay? So you should think about these guys. Okay? They deal with the urgent, but they don't deal with the important. And only now are they figuring out the important. Killing bugs in the kitchen is urgent. Putting weather stripping and keeping the bugs out, that's important. Almost breaking news of almost any kind is not important. It's rarely important. Important means long-term, foundational, coherent, in the interest of many, strategic. Okay? So if you take care of the important things, the urgent things don't show up as often, and the opposite is never true. So the news we consume changes us. These are external factors. So not just the news manufactured by CNN or the media, but the news manufactured by our boss, our investors, our customers, who for us are so important. But Seth Godin says no. Our choice then is to decide whether we want to engage in the hobby of living through other people's breaking news instead of focusing on what's actually important. Think of the word business. Inside there's the word busy. Busy basically means urgent. So we are actually taking care of urgent matters. And have you ever thought that how we take care of urgent matters, what helps us? What helps us is experience. We rely on experience to give us shortcuts. We rely on experience to give us checklists. We rely on experiences for how to. Experience makes us think less instead of think more. Okay, so with that set, let's move on to some practical examples. The first one is what we call people development and perhaps coaching. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's assumptions that we hold about others, influence our actions toward them, and in turn, create results that conform to our assumptions. Basically, we think about something, and because we think about it, it happens. I'm going to share with you an experience I had. Okay, I used to be a partner at KPMG. I run projects. I have about 10 people in my team. But I sometimes manage big projects, like $10 million, which means that I would need about 30 people. And so the first thing I do is I need to go elsewhere to borrow people. So I have my project manager, Bob, who says, hey, Joseph, get me somebody good. So I go to another partner, Steve, okay? And I say, Steve, hey, do you have somebody good? And Steve says, you know what? I got a really good guy. You know, his name is Adam. And I say, great, give me Adam. And I take Adam and I take him to Bob and say, hey, Bob, I found Adam for you. And confidentially, he's an A. All right, you can give him, put him into very difficult projects. Keep an eye on him though, because if something goes wrong with Adam, it's your fault. Because Adam is a high performer. After a couple weeks, Bob comes and says, Joseph, I need somebody else. We need more people. And I say, great, I'm going to go ask Steve again. And I go and ask Steve, and Steve says, I have a problem because all my good guys are gone. I say, hey, but there's somebody out there. And Steve tells me, you know what? Charles is available. I said, okay, great, I'll take Charles. He says, but you know what? I think Charles is a C. I said, okay, but that's all right. We just need someone. So I take Charles and I present him to Bob and say, hey, here's Charles. But keep an eye on Charles because confidentially, he's a C. And after a few weeks, let's say Adam and Charles both mess up in a project. So they both mess up, okay? Which means they both do a bad job. In the case of Adam, I'm going to talk to Bob and say, hey, what happened? You were supposed to keep an eye on him. It's your fault. But in the case of Charles, we will both say, yeah, we knew it was going to happen. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because we already believe that. We don't give Charles the same chance as we would give to Adam. This is an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me go into the area of coaching. There's a technique that we use in coaching, in feedback, that we call situation, behavior, and impact. I'll explain it briefly. Situation is time, place, circumstance. Behavior is what the person did, and impact is how I felt. The whole idea is it's almost like you film something on video, okay, and then you're showing that other person what actually happened. Okay, so it's almost like they're watching a movie of themselves, and therefore it's very factual. And behavior is what the person actually did or said. It's not about, we do not like to use impressions. No impressions on behavior. It's always actual. So this is a technique that's used widely in the US and around the world for providing good feedback in a coaching environment. The question is, why do we do this? Once again, at the center of feedback is we have to notice. In order to notice, we have to be curious. So curiosity drives notice, and then we observe. So we observe the behavior. And why SBI? Because there's no guessing. There will be an agreement on facts. In other words, the other person who's getting the feedback can't say, well, that didn't happen, because we're very factual. We clearly define what happened, when, to whom, and it's based on observations, including what was said. And then the impact is it's focused on my impact, okay, on how I felt as the coach. Okay, so therefore that cannot be challenged since it's my feeling. So SBI is a key first step in opening a dialogue. We tell people to be curious, be specific. Let's not be judgmental. This is where empathy comes in. And use action verbs instead of adjectives. So we don't say that you were good or bad. We say that the client listened to your presentation. I noticed they were taking notes, okay? The impact is tell how it affected you. And then we repeat it in the daily routine. So these are some of the key learnings. So the thing is, why do we tell people to give feedback and don't give advice? Okay, making the invisible visible is a technique that we call. In other words, it's obviously out there, but the person cannot see it. So we help them see it. We don't like to tell people what to do. Your job is to help in making connection, not in offering solutions. So in this world that we live in, I used to work at KPMG, everything is solution-based. Your job is to help them solve their own problem, not for you to solve them. So the idea is, how can we make them solve their own problem instead of us solving them? When we give advice, okay, you provide short-term satisfaction to both the giver and receiver. In training world, we say that when you give advice, you took away the learning opportunity from the person. And we often wonder, why do our people not grow? And oftentimes, the people do not grow because we take away their chance to learn. And because giving advice can be so satisfactory to both the receiver and the giver, we often compare this to, it is being like seduced by the dark side in Star Wars. And once you go down that route, it's very hard to get out of. In the world of selling and negotiation, it is very similar. There's extreme pressure in selling. I need to impress the client. I don't want to be embarrassed. My 2 kids are going to college. I need to show I'm an expert. I need to pay my bills. I did poorly on my last evaluation. I've never failed before. I need to impress my boss. I need to hit my quota, blah, 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 blah. So there's extreme pressure in selling. And we all go through selling training. And then we're told this, hey, study your client's business. Study your product and services to see how they fit the client's business. You meet with the client, you tell the client how great your product service is and how well it fits, and you hope that the client buys your product or service. And this is something that we often go through. But this is exactly the wrong approach. Of course, you want to study your client's business, and of course, you want to study to see how your products will fit. You meet with the client. But the first thing that we do is, instead of telling them anything, is how do we listen to the client? Because when you're trying to sell something, you stop listening. When you're trying to sell something, you're listening for key words. And when the client has actually a bigger problem, you tend to ignore that. So instead of trying to sell something, the goal is to create a trusting relationship. You work together as partners in solving the client's problem. And this requires, once again, empathy. Our experience tells us to look for the quick win. Our experience tells us to be solution-based. In reality, instead of trying to sell solutions, we are losing people who ask great questions and who can expand on that, who can create relationships. Let's talk about presentation and leaving impressions. I've shown a lot of people this slide. The title is History of Art. And if you go to Wikipedia, you will see a definition. Da Vinci, Leonardo was in his renown, blah, 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 blah. Rembrandt, his paintings, prints, he exhibited knowledge, blah, 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 blah. This is on the left side. On the right side, we have something by the artist Donald Seitz. Take a careful look. Which is easier to understand? This is Mona Lisa. She doesn't look like Mona Lisa at all, but you know it's Mona Lisa. And then you take a look at each one of these other drawings that he has. Donald Seitz has done something that people can rarely do. What he has done is he found the essence of each of these artists. You might not have time now, but I would suggest that you Google Rothko and Pollock and take a look at their drawings, and you will find that Mr. Seitz has captured the essence of their art. We love to use drawings in this way because this triggers the right side of our brain, the creative side of our brain. The creative side of our brain loves to hear, loves to see images. And when we see images, it actually allows us to accept more. The logical side of our brain loves to see words. The logical side of our brain is geared toward saying no to things by analyzing it. So whenever we do a presentation and we want people to have an open mind, we like to tap into the creative side of the brain, which is the right side of the brain. But experience tells us that we want to use logic. We want to be right. We want to use words. That is not as effective as we would like to believe. Okay. I have a few more slides, so if you could bear with me. Something very similar here. Nate Silver is a New York Times, or was a New York Times statistician. He does a lot of political statistics. In 2013, after the 2012 election, he wrote a book called Signal and Noise. And there he talks about the concept of accurate versus precise. And accurate versus precise is quite important because we tend to confuse the two. And here he has a very interesting drawing. He says that this is not accurate and not precise. So these are all over the place. This is not accurate and not precise. On the other hand, this is accurate but not precise. So you're sort of surrounding the bullseye but not precise. Now this is precise, but it's not accurate. And this is accurate and precise. Nate Silver and actually Jim Collins challenges us. Today we often think this is accurate. So if you look at next year's forecast for the economic indicator, if someone tells you that their growth is going to be 3.5%, you're going to say, oh, okay. But someone else comes, it's 3.473%. You will absolutely believe this number in spite of the fact that there is no more basis in fact in this number than in this number. In other words, we have bought into this. Nate Silver's book basically tells us that Lehman shock in 2008 occurred because of this tendency. Okay, and the scary thing today is that this is exactly what big data is trying to sell us. We try to answer increasingly irrelevant questions with increasingly precise answers. Those are the words from Jim Collins. As we get closer to an end, I'm going to use the words of Mr. Deming, who is very popular in Japan. He says that a bad system will beat a good person every time. In other words, there are too many bad systems out there that rely on experiences. You go out and hire the best people, but you put rules upon them in which they can't think. They're not allowed to fail. So one of Peter Drucker's essence of this work was his belief in the power of organizations and the good that it can do for society. And it goes back to what we talked about originally about contribution, communication, teamwork, self-development, and development of others. And so the reason you practice self-management is to help yourself become better. The reason you want to make yourself better is so that you can help those around you become better. And that's what leaders do. So leaders help to make the people around them become successful. And this is what contribution is all about. And let me wrap up with this story. I talked about Richard Thaler. He's from University of Chicago, and he teaches behavioral science. One day, what he wanted to do was to create an exam that would separate the stars and the average Joes and duds. Okay, he promised them that he would curve the score so that no matter what they got, they would always get something like a B+. An average grade would always be a B+. This is graduate school. What happened was after he gave the exam, the average score was 72. And then they were in an uproar. Their principal complaint was that the average score was 72 out of 100. And what was odd about this reaction was that I had already explained that the average numerical score on the exam had absolutely no effect on the distribution of letter grades. We employed a curve in which the average grade was a B+, and only a tiny number of students received grades below a C. I told the class this, but it had no effect on the students' mood, so they were still angry. Remember, these are grad school students. These are smart kids. They still hated my exam, and they were none too happy with me either. So as a young professor, so this is when he was younger, he worried about keeping my job. I wasn't sure what to do. By the way, Richard Thaler is considered to be a good candidate for the Nobel Prize at some point in the future. So finally, an idea occurred to me. On the next exam, I raised the points available for a perfect score to 137. This exam turned out to be harder than the first. Students only got 70% of the answers right, but the average numerical score was 96. The students were delighted. So they were happy because now they got 96. And these are grad school. And this actually shows us an essence about human beings, is that we are not logical animals. Okay. Now, Thaler actually confided that he used 137 for a very simple reason. Number one, he wanted the average score to be in the 90s. And then number two, very few people know how to divide 137 into something. They don't know what it would. If it were 150, people will figure it out quickly, but nobody can divide 137. So one of the missions that we have is to find out what that 137 is for the people around you. not the logical answer, but the emotional answer. And oftentimes, when we look at that, our experience may get in the way. Okay, Ali, could you take it away? I'm sorry I went over a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. And folks, we are now open for question and answer. So if you have any questions, you can always put it in the question box, or you could equally raise your hand. There is a hand icon available on the console, so please click on it if you want to speak directly with Mr. Lee. So meantime, we have a couple of questions in the box, so let me go straight. First one. Mr. Lee, you mentioned that you do training in Japan. It seems they are quite a bit ahead than the US or Europe in terms of treating their employees well. What are they looking for from Western style of training?
Thanks, Ali. As I mentioned earlier, Japan is a very unique country. They have, in the 1970s was when they grew the most, and since they've sort of been living off of the legacy. If you take a look at successes coming out from Japan in the last 2 decades and so forth, there aren't actually that many. Toyota and all of those, they're from the old days. Sony is no longer a power player in the electronics market. And if you take a look at the market of mobile phones, they're not there at all. And what they've realized was that they have become complacent in the domestic market and their people aren't growing. They're realizing that they need to, instead of worrying about failing and so forth, they need to adopt new ways. It's not that they think that the Western style is good or bad. It's what they know now is that they cannot live in a world in which they constantly train people simply to follow rules. And this is a challenge that they have. They think that, for instance, the one way to to resolve their problem is everybody speaks English. It's sort of a yes and no, because Japan grew in the 1970s when the country was much less English speaking. So the answer isn't speaking English. The answer may be that how to create a culture in which people took extraordinary risk, at the same time understanding the concept of entrepreneurship within an organization.
We have one from Mr. Murad Daudov. The question is, do you have a practical advices for daily life, how we can stop falling into mistake of relying on our experience, relying on what we know for sure? Any tools or techniques?
Okay, so if I understand the question is, are there any techniques out there that are available? And I think that the quote from Yao Ming is very powerful, is that how do we, I don't like to go into the world of let's try harder or let's be stronger willed. Most of the tools that are available are what we call creating good habits, and habits are behavior. So for instance, if you take a look at the world of diets, the diets that work most effectively aren't the ones that say you have to control your weight because you don't want to look fat, blah, blah, blah. The ones that work the best are ones that create habits. Some people even lock their refrigerators, but the thing is they go on a schedule. So the thing is, once again, we focus on behavior. For instance, one thing that people can do is to write a journal and look at the behaviors and reflect on what you do. The other habit that people can do is talk to people and ask for honest feedback using tools like SBI. If you want to become more self-aware or help others, you can use more action verbs to describe not only what others do, but yourself. When you look at yourself, instead of using adjectives to describe what you've done or how you did, write actual words and activities. And what happens is when you focus on activities, you will change the activities. And the neat thing about human behavior is the only way to change behavior is to measure it. So a lot of people, they say, I want to walk more. How many steps have you taken? How many minutes out of the day? And then we quantify activities so that they become more easier to repeat. I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you very much. Let me go to another question. Okay, there's one. I disagree with you when you say experience doesn't matter, since it's helped me and many of the people I know. Isn't this just a theory rather than practical?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say that it is theory more than practical because there's actually a lot of science, and I don't want to denigrate experience. I don't want to say experience doesn't matter. What I'd like to say is that experience can be something that makes us not change our mind. And when we listen to ourselves make argument with others, and then we cannot win the argument based on the strength of the argument, we often say, well, I've been doing this for 25 years. And that actually becomes a theoretical argument, as if doing something for more years makes you more qualified. It is, for instance, we tend to think really smart people should become better leaders. But if you take a look at many of the leadership positions around the world, very few people have PhDs. They have a lot of human skills. So from a practical standpoint, we know that experience in and of itself doesn't get us there. Once again, experience, I don't want to say is unimportant, but at the same time, it could be one of the toughest hurdles to go through because we rely so much on it. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. We have another interesting one. You said you are a risk taker and a big gambler. But isn't it experience is a prerequisite to take risks, leveraging upon the experience you have gained to not to take the same risks again?
Okay, that's maybe I can answer that question this way. If we rely always on our experience, whether to take risks or not, we are essentially growing within a box that we've defined that we cannot get out of. If experience becomes the primary force of whether we should or should not take risks, in other words, we can never go into the world of the unknown. And there's always a world out there that is the unknown. And obviously, you know, we don't want to risk the livelihood of a company and so forth. I think Peter Drucker actually had an interesting quote about that. I think he mentioned that the people who take great risk, who don't care for rules and so forth, typically make about 2 big mistakes every year. And then he went on to say that people who risk manage, who are extremely focused on following procedures, they also make 2 big mistakes every year. And what he was trying to get to was that whether we take risks or not, the world is changing around us, and therefore we will make mistakes. And going back to my days of doing consulting for banks, and when they had very problems of delinquent loans and so forth, what we learned was that loan officers who have never dealt with a problem client before are the biggest risks because they have never failed before. And the scary thing for us often is people who haven't failed. And the thing is, people who have failed actually are willing to fail again, but they have more that they're saying, hey, this is within the realm of what we can accept. And we can call that experience. Okay, so it's sort of a yes and no answer. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. We have some interesting questions popping up. So another one. If experience is not important, what would you advise to recruiters while they're always looking to hire an experienced person?
What I would suggest, many of you may have heard of Google and how they interview people. Laszlo Bock wrote a book about 2 years ago about the Google HR process. And actually, for them, experience is important, but the question is what kind of experience? Okay. The thing is that I think and there may be recruiters here, what recruiters should be looking for is not the experience, but whether the experience that they had is transferable to the new job that is at hand. And many people are not very good at taking that leap, and that's why the recruiting business is actually quite full of failures. There's a lot of research to show that hiring a person randomly gives you about the same success rate as using a professional recruiter. Okay, and the reason is simple. It's a confirmation bias that we have. We tend to hire people we like. In spite of what we're told about experience and so forth, when we meet someone, if we like them, we will like their experience. If we don't like them, no matter what experience they have, we probably will not look at that very carefully. But what Laszlo Bock wanted to do was to take all of that out of the equation and ask them very probing, specific questions. I would suggest taking a look at that book. That's a very well written book about the recruiting process and whether experience comes in. By the way, one thing that Google found out in that book was that grades in school and the type of college they went to have almost zero bearing on the performance of individuals at Google after 2 years. They say in the first 2 years there may be some impact, but after 2 years, there's almost zero correlation between your grades and the school you went to and your performance at Google. So experience may be a little bit different, but there could be some similar components there. Okay, the name is, by the way, Laszlo Bock. And he was the former HR director at Google. He quit a few months ago. Interesting book.
Mr. Willis, some people are asking, is it possible to share the name of the book with the link, or?
I don't think I have that in the bibliography, but I think my email address is on the slides. So email me and I'll send you the link.
All right, fair enough. So let me go and take one last question. How do you deal with cultural differences in training between the East and the West?
Thanks very much for that. I'm not a big believer in cultural quote unquote training, for the simple reason that oftentimes people use it as an excuse to not do something. I do a lot of training in Japan, and they ask the question, what are the cultural differences between the US and Japan? And yes, of course there are. But what happens is when we start studying about cultural differences, we tend to focus on them and use that as an excuse for things not working instead of looking at ourselves. So if you go to the States or Japan, let's take a look at somebody like an accountant or somebody who does sales. If you go to the US and Japan, the accountant, they actually share very similar culture in terms of their details, their precision focusing on dollars. And on the other hand, if you look at a salesperson, okay, they're looking at how to get their expenses reimbursed. So a salesperson in the US and Japan share a more common culture than the difference between Japan and US culture. For instance, company culture often is more important than country culture. And actually, once again, Laszlo Bock addressed that when he said that the Google culture has to be the #1 thing before Japan or US. We have to make sure that the Google culture is there.